Sarah May could feel the cold biting through her shawl, her breath visible in the frosty air as the wagon creaked and groaned over the treacherous mountain path. The long, unforgiving road stretched ahead, the ruts deep and jagged, carved over countless winters that had no mercy. She tightened her grip on the thin fabric, knuckles white, her heart heavier with each jolt of the wagon. In the back, the noise of the wheels grinding against the rough trail seemed to echo her parents. Harsh words that still rang in her ears, words she couldn't escape. "A crippled girl brings nothing but shame to our family name." Her father's voice had sliced through her like a knife. He had declared it so coldly, as though she were no more than a burden he was finally ridding himself of. "She's 19, he had said. "No man will have her. We've fed her long enough. Better she serves a purpose somewhere else." Quote. Her mother had nodded, her silence colder than any winter wind, already counting the silver coins that would seal her fate. A fate worse than death, perhaps, because it was not just her body they were trading. It was her soul. As the wagon dipped lower into the valley, Sarah May closed her eyes. The wind outside rattled against the wood of the cart, a mournful sound, but inside, the silence was thick and suffocating. A shiver ran down her spine as she thought of the man waiting for her at the end of this journey, Caleb Stone. The man who was to take her in, though she wasn't sure what he truly wanted with her. They said he lived alone, beyond the reach of town, a man haunted by his own demons. Her parents had called him a charity case, someone too isolated to care about the cruel hand they were dealing her. He was supposed to need help. Help that would come in the form of a 19-year-old crippled girl who had been sold like cattle. The trail wound through a narrow pass, tall evergreens surrounding her on all sides, their branches heavy with snow. The mountain air grew thin, colder with every passing mile, until even the trees seemed to bend with the weight of it. Sarah May looked out at the vast emptiness that stretched out before her, feeling smaller than the snowflakes that drifted aimlessly through the air. She wasn't sure what she expected of the man she was being sent to. Stories about Caleb Stone ran wild in town. Some said he had been a soldier once, scarred by war. Others whispered that he had run from a darker past, leaving behind whatever trace of humanity remained in him. One thing was certain, though. Caleb had been a ghost, vanishing into the wilds of the Colorado Rockies and never returning to the settlements. He was the sort of man whose name passed from mouth to mouth with both fear and respect. The kind of man who could survive the worst storms, who could track prey through blizzards, who had turned his back on civilization. Sarah May was not sure what he would see in her, or if he would see anything at all. She was just a burden now. A girl with an ankle that had never quite healed right, and a past that was bruised with shame. Her father had told her that no man would ever look at her and see anything worth loving. And so, when the wagon driver, a rough-looking man named Murphy, finally pulled the horses to a stop, Sarah May hesitated. The world around her had grown quieter. The mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks cutting through the pale sky. There, amidst the stillness, stood Caleb Stone, as silent and imposing as the mountains themselves. "You're the one Benjamin Crawford sent?" Caleb's voice broke through the silence, deep and measured, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made Sarah May's heart race. "Yes, sir," she answered, her voice barely more than a whisper, a quiet surrender in the face of everything she had been taught to accept. Caleb Stone didn't speak again. He simply watched her as she stepped out of the wagon, her left ankle twisting painfully beneath her, forcing her to catch herself on the wagon's edge. She could feel his gaze on her, but it wasn't the kind of look she had grown so used to. The pity, the discomfort. Instead, it was an assessing, quiet look, one that didn't seem to carry any judgment, but neither did it offer the comfort she longed for. He was taller than she had imagined, easily a head above her, his broad shoulders encased in a thick woolen coat that was as worn as his expression. His face was weathered, dark stubble lining his jaw, his eyes dark and unreadable, carrying a burden that spoke of years spent alone in these mountains. His hands were large, calloused, scars decorating his rough fingers like a map of a life spent in survival. "You look frozen to the bone," he said at last, his voice softer than she expected. "Come inside." Sarah May felt a strange weight lift in her chest, not from relief, but from the way his voice was not cruel, not cold. Caleb Stone didn't offer pity. He simply saw her, acknowledged her, in a way that no one ever had. She followed him into the cabin, the warmth inside contrasting sharply with the bitter cold she had carried with her all her life. The heat from the stone fireplace washed over her, the smell of pine and firewood filling the small room. "Sit by the fire," Caleb instructed, moving around her with quiet efficiency. He placed a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. She hesitated at first, not used to such care, but when she tasted the bitter warmth, a small spark of comfort began to form within her chest. "Thank you," she murmured, staring into the flames. She could feel her heartbeat slow, the tension in her body beginning to release for the first time in days. Caleb didn't respond right away, though she could feel his gaze on her. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words felt deliberate, as though he carefully chose each one. Sarah May watched him in return, his movements fluid, practiced, a man who had long lived by his own rules. "Not much to offer," Caleb said finally, his voice gruff, though there was something in it that was gentler than expected. "But it'll keep you alive." Sarah May couldn't find the words to respond. How could she tell him that she didn't want just survival anymore? She wanted more than that. Something that could make her feel whole again. The quiet between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was a silence that spoke of shared isolation, of two people who understood what it was like to live outside the world's expectations. And yet, in that silence, there was something else, something that Sarah May hadn't felt in a long time. It was the feeling of being seen, not just looked at, but truly seen. The wind howled outside, an unrelenting roar that made the walls of Caleb Stone's cabin creak and groan. But inside, where the fire crackled and the warmth wrapped around them like a blanket, Sarah May felt something shift. It wasn't just the heat of the fire, or the stew Caleb had set to simmer in the pot over the hearth. It was the unexpected sense of safety she hadn't felt in so long. The evening passed quietly. Caleb had offered no grand gestures, no false comforts, but there was something in the way he moved around her, calm, deliberate, that told Sarah May she was no longer just a burden. She wasn't a chore for him to shoulder or a piece of livestock to be discarded. No, he simply saw her as someone who needed warmth, who needed care, and that, in itself, was enough to make her feel something she had forgotten: worth. She had slept in a small bedroom off the main room, tucked beneath thick quilts that felt almost like a dream after years of cold, hard beds. The quilts themselves spoke of care, each stitch a mark of patience and dedication. She ran her fingers along the edges before she drifted off to sleep, wondering who had made them, who had poured so much love into each thread. But sleep didn't come easily. Her mind kept wandering back to the journey she had made, the memories of her parents, their coldness still fresh in her mind. She thought of her father's satisfaction as he pocketed the silver coins. She thought of her mother's silence, as though she had already accepted the fate that had been forced upon her daughter. Sarah May had never been treated like a person, just a burden, a mistake made years ago. And now, here she was, in a strange cabin, in the care of a man who might or might not want her around. By morning, Caleb was already outside, chopping wood. The rhythmic sound of the axe striking against the logs reached her ears, drawing her from her restless slumber. She pulled the quilts from her body and wrapped the thin shawl around her shoulders, but it did little to ward off the chill that lingered in the air. The mountain was silent, save for the steady rise and fall of Caleb's work. When she stepped outside, the world seemed untouched. Snow-covered trees stood tall and still, their heavy branches bowing beneath the weight of the frost. The crisp morning air made Sarah May's breath catch in her throat, but it was a welcome feeling, one that reminded her she was alive, despite everything that had happened. She hadn't realized until that very moment just how much she had been holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the moment when someone would decide she wasn't worth their time. But Caleb didn't look at her that way. He paused when he saw her standing there, unsure of herself, her gaze on the ground. "You sleep well?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Sarah May nodded, though her voice caught in her throat. "Better than I have in years," she admitted softly. "Good," Caleb said, turning back to his work. "There's plenty to do. You feel up to it?" Quote. Sarah May hesitated, her gaze falling to the ground beneath her feet. She knew her ankle wasn't quite right, never had been, but she wasn't going to tell him that. She wasn't going to make excuses. Not when she was finally in a place where she could prove that she could be useful. "I can help," she said, the words steady even though doubt lingered in the back of her mind. "What needs doing?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "Water's down the hill. Needs hauling up to the cabin before it freezes. And the goats need feeding. Don't overdo it, though. The altitude's tough on those unused to it." She nodded, trying to appear more capable than she felt. "I can do that." Caleb glanced at her, his brow furrowed in thought. "It's a long walk. I'll come with you." Sarah May felt a flicker of warmth at the offer, but she quickly suppressed it. No one had ever treated her like she mattered, and she wasn't about to let herself be fooled now. She had seen enough of the world to know that kindness always came with a price. But Caleb seemed sincere. His eyes, dark and steady, held no hidden agenda, no pity, no expectations. Just a quiet recognition of her struggle, and the willingness to let her decide for herself how much she could handle. They made their way down the hill, the wind biting through Sarah May's shawl, her legs trembling beneath her as the cold seeped into her bones. The path was treacherous, the snow thick and slippery, but she didn't ask for help. She wouldn't. When they reached the spring, Caleb wasted no time in breaking through the thin layer of ice that had formed over the water. The sound of the axe striking the ice echoed through the stillness, and soon enough he had the water flowing again, the bucket filling with the fresh, clear liquid. Sarah May stood nearby, watching him as he worked. There was something graceful about the way he moved, despite his size. He was a man used to the land, to the mountain, to the quiet rhythm of life in the wilderness. He didn't complain. He didn't hurry. He simply did what needed to be done. As she watched him, Sarah May felt the weight of the years she had spent in silence. The years of being unseen, of being told she wasn't good enough. Her ankle, always an obstacle, had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with her. But Caleb didn't look at her as if she were broken. He didn't treat her like the world had taught her to expect. Her thoughts were interrupted when Caleb glanced over at her, his eyes thoughtful. "You're doing all right," he said with a small nod. "You don't have to prove anything here." Sarah May didn't know how to respond to that. Her throat tightened, and she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Hope for what, though? As they made their way back to the cabin, the walk slower now that the water had been hauled, she kept her thoughts to herself. Caleb didn't push her to speak, though his occasional glances told her he was watching, paying attention to the quiet spaces between them. Inside, the fire was already crackling. The heat was a welcome relief from the bitter cold that clung to her skin. Caleb poured her another cup of coffee and slid it over to her without a word. Sarah May took the mug in her hands, feeling the warmth seep into her cold fingers, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply exist. She was here, alive, and maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to feel like she had a place in the world. The days rolled by slowly, each one marked by the steady rhythm of mountain life. Sarah May woke before the sun each morning, her body stiff from the cold and the long hours of work that Caleb had set before her. There was always something to do, feeding the animals, collecting wood, preparing meals, and though her ankle ached with each step, she never complained. It was not the life she had ever imagined for herself, but in some strange, quiet way, it was beginning to feel like a life worth living. Caleb was always there, a steady presence that never asked for anything more than what was necessary. He didn't demand her gratitude or her admiration. He didn't seem to need anything at all, except perhaps the companionship of someone who could help fill the silence of the mountain cabin. His silence, though, was not like hers. His was a silence that spoke of deep thought, of a life spent thinking about what had been and what might come. He moved through the cabin with the ease of someone who had spent years alone, doing the work of survival without question or complaint. Yet, somehow, his actions never made Sarah May feel small. She had expected, after years of rejection and judgment, that Caleb would eventually tire of her weakness, of her disability, of her quiet way of moving through the world. But instead, he treated her with a respect she had never known. He didn't look at her with pity or frustration. When she worked, he simply watched her with quiet approval. When she struggled, he didn't offer solutions. He just let her figure things out on her own, but never out of neglect. One afternoon, while Caleb was out checking the trap lines, Sarah May was left to herself in the cabin. She had taken it upon herself to mend a worn coat, stitching the rough fabric with the same care that Caleb had put into his cabin. The rhythmic motion of the needle passing through the fabric was soothing, a gentle reprieve from the constant ache in her ankle. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to the past, to the life she had left behind. She thought of the town, the harsh whispers, the cold glances. She thought of her father's smirk, his words still echoing in her mind like a curse. "She's damaged goods, no better than a broken horse." It was hard to forget the way he had sold her, the way her mother had remained silent, eyes downcast, as if she had no right to feel anything but shame. Sarah May could still feel the weight of their rejection, as heavy as the snow that blanketed the mountains. But here, in Caleb's cabin, there was no judgment. There was no condemnation. For the first time, she began to wonder if she could be more than what they had told her she was. If, perhaps, she could be someone who was worth more than the broken pieces of herself that she had spent so long hiding. The sound of Caleb's boots crunching in the snow outside broke her from her thoughts. She glanced up, startled, and quickly placed the coat aside, not wanting him to think she had been idle. But as he stepped inside, his gaze fell not on the unfinished work, but on her face. "You all right?" His voice, low and steady, carried the weight of a man who had seen more than his fair share of suffering. Sarah May nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "I'm fine." Just thinking. Caleb didn't press further. Instead, he set his rifle by the door and moved toward the fireplace, stoking the fire with a few pieces of dry kindling. As he worked, Sarah May could feel the quiet warmth of the cabin spreading through her chest. There was something about the way Caleb moved, with such purpose and ease, that made her feel both grounded and adrift at the same time. His presence was like the mountain itself, immovable, steady, yet capable of great change. "You've been quiet today," he remarked, glancing over at her as he wiped the sweat from his brow. Sarah May hesitated before answering. "I've been thinking about the past, about where I came from." Caleb's gaze softened, but he didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, he crossed the room and sat down across from her, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "You don't have to talk about it," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But don't let it bury you." Sarah May's heart tightened at his words. She had never had anyone tell her not to bury the past before. People had always expected her to hide it, to pretend it didn't matter. But Caleb's words felt different. They felt like a permission she hadn't known she needed. "I'm trying to move on," she said quietly, her voice catching. "But it's hard. The weight of it all. It's like it's always with me, always following me." Caleb nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. "The past has a way of doing that, but it's not the weight of what's behind you that matters. It's what you choose to carry forward." His words settled into the space between them, and for the first time since she had arrived at the cabin, Sarah May felt as though something inside her had shifted. It was a subtle thing, just the faintest stirring in her chest. But it was enough to make her believe, for the first time in years, that there could be something more than survival. There could be hope. The evening passed in comfortable silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the occasional gust of wind rattling against the cabin walls. Sarah May finished her work on the coat, her fingers moving with practiced precision. When she set it aside, Caleb stood and stretched, his back popping with the effort. "Well, that's enough work for one day," he said, his tone casual, but there was something in his voice that made Sarah May look up. "You've been working hard too," she replied, her voice soft but sincere. "You should rest." Caleb's gaze met hers, and for a moment the world outside seemed to fade away. "I've had my share of rest," he said quietly. "Now it's your turn." Sarah May smiled, though she could feel the unease in her chest. She had never been the one to accept rest, to take something for herself. But tonight, with Caleb watching her with quiet expectation, it felt easier than it ever had before. The days blurred together in a seamless flow of quiet work and quiet moments. Caleb Stone, with his steady presence and careful consideration, became a constant in Sarah May's life, like the mountains themselves, strong, silent, and unyielding. The winter continued its slow retreat, but there was no sign of it in Caleb's cabin. Inside, there was warmth, not just from the fire that burned brightly each night, but from something deeper, something more elusive. Sarah May found herself smiling more often now, in the mornings when she would tend to the goats, or when Caleb would call out from the door with an easy grin. "Another storm coming, you'd best prepare." His humor, dry and simple, was something she had never expected. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it was real. Like the mountain itself, it was a stark contrast to the world she had known, where every day had felt like an uphill battle against rejection, against a life that never seemed to fit. One afternoon, as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow, Sarah May stood by the cabin door, watching Caleb work. He was outside, chopping wood with the same rhythmic precision that had become almost hypnotic to her. She admired the way his muscles moved beneath his thick coat, the steady rise and fall of his breath in the crisp air. There was something undeniably captivating about him, something in the way he never seemed to hurry, never seemed to be bothered by the cold or the endless work. "Caleb," she called, her voice cutting through the air, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to speak at that moment. Maybe it was the way he had been looking at her lately, like he was seeing something in her that she hadn't yet recognized in herself. He paused in his work and looked over his shoulder, the muscles in his arms flexing as he lowered the axe. His face was marked by the long years of mountain living, but his eyes, they were still clear, deep, and steady. "You need something?" he asked, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. Sarah May bit her lip, unsure of how to frame what was pressing on her mind. It wasn't a question. Not really. It was something she hadn't fully understood herself. I'm not used to this," she admitted, gesturing toward the cabin, toward the work, toward him. "Not used to being here, to having someone not judge me, not expect me to be something I'm not." Caleb stood still for a moment, looking at her. There was no pity in his gaze, no surprise, only quiet understanding. Slowly, he set the axe down and moved toward her, his boots crunching in the snow as he walked. "You've been taught to believe your worth comes from what you can give, from how well you can serve," he said softly, his voice quiet but firm. "But that's not what matters here. Not to me. It never has." Quote, his words, simple as they were, had an unexpected weight. Sarah May felt them settle deep into her chest, filling the empty spaces where her self-doubt had been. She had spent so many years convinced she was only valuable when she was useful, when she could make herself indispensable. But Caleb's words shattered that belief, leaving her standing in the silence of the moment with a new kind of understanding. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly, the words slipping from her mouth before she could stop them. She hadn't meant to share this, but it felt like something that had been buried so long that it was finally emerging. Caleb didn't respond right away, but his gaze softened. He reached out, not with pity, but with a quiet tenderness that spoke more than any words could. He placed a hand on her shoulder, not in a comforting way, but as a gesture of mutual understanding. "Neither did I," he said, his voice rough with something unspoken. "But here we are, aren't we?" For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The snow continued to fall around them, drifting lazily in the wind. The mountains rose in the distance, massive and timeless, and yet for all their immensity, they didn't seem so cold, not now. Not when she was standing here, with Caleb, with someone who saw her as more than just the sum of her scars. Later that evening, after they had shared a simple meal of rabbit stew and bread, Sarah May sat quietly by the fire, staring into the flames. The weight of the past still pressed on her chest, but it was lighter now, as if the fire was slowly melting the frozen places inside her. Caleb was sitting across from her, his expression unreadable, but the way he watched her from across the room, it was different now. There was no more distance between them, no more unspoken walls. The quiet was comfortable, a silence that wasn't empty, but full. Full of understanding, full of unspoken words that didn't need to be said aloud. The fire crackled, sending small embers dancing into the air, and Sarah May let her mind wander. In the distance, the wind began to pick up again, the howl of the coming storm. A familiar sound that always made her think of the coldness she had once known. But tonight, the cold outside didn't feel so isolating. It felt like something they could weather together. After a while, Caleb broke the silence. "You've been working hard," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Taking care of things here." "I've had practice," Sarah May replied, the corner of her mouth turning upward just a fraction. "Taking care of things. It's all I've ever known." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time. "I didn't think you'd stay long," he admitted quietly, his voice holding a hint of vulnerability. "I thought you'd leave, sooner or later, like everyone else." The confession hung in the air between them, an unexpected admission that made Sarah May's chest tighten. She hadn't thought about it that way, hadn't considered that Caleb might be just as afraid of being left behind as she had been. She blinked, unsure of how to respond. But then she didn't need to. Instead, she simply leaned forward, her gaze steady as she looked at him. "I'm here," she said simply, as if those two words could bridge the gap between them. For the first time, Caleb's lips parted in a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I guess you are." The storm outside began to roar in earnest, its winds pushing against the thick walls of the cabin. But inside, in the warm glow of the firelight, everything felt safe. Everything felt real. Sarah May didn't know what would come of this life, what would become of her or Caleb, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could stay. And that, in itself, was enough. The days that followed seemed to stretch on, each one a blend of simple chores, quiet meals, and moments where Sarah May began to notice the small things about Caleb that made him seem less like the solitary mountain man and more like someone who had, perhaps, forgotten how to share himself with another person. She had learned, in the weeks since her arrival, that Caleb's silence wasn't a reflection of coldness. It was a quiet strength, a comfort that came from years of being alone in the mountains. She had always been afraid of being alone, of being unseen. But here, in the stillness of the cabin, she was learning that solitude didn't have to be lonely. There was something unspoken between her and Caleb, a quiet understanding that didn't require words. Still, she found herself wondering, often, what Caleb had left behind in his life. He had told her little about his past, and she hadn't pressed. In truth, she didn't want to know just yet. Some stories, she thought, were better told when they were ready to be heard. One evening, after a long day of clearing snow from around the cabin, Sarah May sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames curling around her tired limbs. Caleb was working in the corner, his hands busy with repairing one of the cabin's windows. The cabin had become their shared space, no longer just a place where Sarah May came to escape, but a home that was slowly being shaped by both of them. "You've been quiet tonight," Caleb said, his voice carrying the weight of a question. Sarah May looked up from the fire, meeting his gaze. There was no judgment in his expression, just the familiar, quiet attentiveness she had come to expect from him. It was a kindness that had grown on her, like the warmth of the hearth, constant and steady. "I was thinking about what you said," she replied slowly. "About carrying what you choose to carry." Caleb raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "And what are you choosing to carry, Sarah May?" Quote. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the wooden chair beneath her. "I think I'm starting to choose to carry hope," she said quietly. "It's not easy, but it feels different from before." Caleb didn't respond right away. Instead, he set down his tools and moved to the fire, his gaze thoughtful. "Hope is a heavy thing to carry," he said quietly. "It's easy to lose, to let it slip away when things get hard." "I've lost hope before," Sarah May admitted, her voice soft but clear. "I think I lost it the day my parents decided I wasn't worth keeping." Her words hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that made her chest tighten. But Caleb's silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a space for understanding, for healing, and for Sarah May to say things she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. "Sometimes," Caleb began, his voice low and deliberate, "we have to remind ourselves that we're worth something, even when the world doesn't seem to see it." Quote. She looked at him, her heart catching in her throat. "And how do you remind yourself?" Quote. He didn't answer immediately, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a sadness that she hadn't seen before. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again, his voice a bit gruffer than before. "You find something worth fighting for, something that makes you believe in the future." Sarah May nodded, understanding more than she wanted to. She didn't know if she was ready to fight for her future, but with Caleb's quiet strength beside her, she could begin to imagine a future at all. The next day, Caleb took her with him into the mountains. The snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing patches of dark earth, but the peaks still held onto winter's grip, standing tall and proud against the clear blue sky. The air was thin the higher they climbed, but Sarah May found herself adjusting, her breath no longer coming in sharp gasps as it had in the beginning. Caleb had asked her to help gather firewood from a spot near the ridge, where he said the trees were dense enough to survive the harshest winters. The work was hard, cutting through the snow and ice, hauling branches down the slope, but Sarah May didn't complain. There was something in the simple labor that gave her a sense of purpose, a sense of pride she hadn't felt in a long time. Each log she carried felt like a small victory, each step through the snow a reminder that she was capable of more than she had been told. As they reached the spot Caleb had pointed to, Sarah May paused, looking out over the valley below. The view took her breath away, the wide expanse of white snow, the distant peaks rising like giants in the distance. The sight was awe-inspiring, but it also reminded her of how far she had come, how far Caleb had come. Neither of them had chosen this life, but somehow they had built something here together, something neither of them had expected. Caleb stood beside her, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his posture that spoke volumes. He was content, she realized. Not just in the work, but in the life they had found together, in the quiet understanding they shared, without needing to speak it aloud. For a moment, the world felt still, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The wind had died down, leaving only the soft sound of their breath in the cold air. "It's beautiful here," Sarah May said, her voice quiet as she glanced at Caleb. "I never thought I'd feel this way about a place like this. So peaceful." Quote. Caleb nodded, his eyes thoughtful as he looked out at the view. Peace is something we both had to find. Didn't come easy. But it's here now. The words settled into Sarah May's chest like a warm ember, and for the first time she truly felt at peace with herself. The weight of her past, while still heavy, no longer defined her. She had the power to move forward, to choose hope, to choose love, and she was beginning to believe that she deserved it. As they turned back toward the cabin, the weight of their shared work and their shared silence felt less like a burden and more like something that had become a part of her. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And for the first time in her life, she felt as though she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days passed, and with each one, Sarah May felt the weight of the past lifting, little by little. The mountains, once a place of isolation and despair, had become a sanctuary. Caleb's cabin, once a cold and impersonal refuge, had transformed into a home. She was no longer just a guest in his world. She was a part of it, woven into the rhythm of his life. The snow had begun to melt, revealing the first signs of spring. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the streams that had been frozen solid for months were now flowing freely, their icy prisons shattered by the warming sun. Life was stirring again in the wilderness, and with it, a sense of renewal that Sarah May had never experienced before. It was early one morning, as the sun's first light filtered through the trees, that Caleb asked her to come with him to check on the boundary fence. The work was simple but necessary, a task that would ensure the animals stayed safe as the weather warmed. Sarah May had become accustomed to working alongside him, their silences no longer uncomfortable, but filled with a quiet understanding that spoke more than words could. As they made their way to the fence, Sarah May noticed the way Caleb moved. There was a grace in his every step, a quiet strength that had always been there, but had only revealed itself gradually, like the land awakening after a long winter. She watched him not for the first time and wondered what had brought him to this remote place. What had caused a man like him to retreat so far into the mountains, away from everything he had once known? Caleb must have sensed her gaze on him, for he glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice low and steady. Sarah May hesitated before answering. "I was thinking about how different things are now, how much has changed since I first got here." Caleb didn't answer right away. He just kept walking, his gaze forward, as if considering her words. "Some changes happen slowly," he said after a moment, "like the seasons. You don't notice them until they've already come." Sarah May nodded, the weight of his words settling on her chest. She had felt those changes, too, slow, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. It was the way she moved through the world now, with a steadiness she had never known before. The way she no longer flinched when Caleb's eyes met hers, as if afraid he might see something unworthy. She had found strength here. She had found courage, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments. The moments when Caleb had been there, steady and unwavering, as she learned to trust again. And now, as they worked side by side, Sarah May began to realize something else, that she didn't just need Caleb. She wanted him, not as a savior or a source of refuge, but as a partner, as someone who had become as much a part of her life as the mountains themselves. By the time they finished with the fence, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the valley. Caleb stood back, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the work they had done. The fence was sturdy, reinforced for the coming months, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah May felt a sense of pride in her work. "You did good," Caleb said, his voice quieter than usual. "Better than I thought you would." Sarah May felt a flush of warmth spread across her cheeks at his words. "I've been learning," she replied, her voice soft but confident. "From you." Caleb's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes that wasn't just quiet understanding. It was something deeper, something that made Sarah May's heart skip a beat. "You've learned more than you know," he said quietly, "and I've learned more than I ever expected." She looked up at him, the words hanging in the air between them. She had wanted to ask him about the past, about what had led him to this remote life, but she didn't need to anymore. She knew he would tell her when he was ready. And when he spoke again, his voice was low, almost hesitant. "I didn't think I'd ever have someone here again," he said, his words heavier than the weight of the logs they had moved earlier. "Not after her." Sarah May's breath caught in her throat at the mention of his wife. She had known that Caleb had loved someone before her, someone who had shaped his life, his solitude. But now, in the quiet of the moment, she could feel the weight of his grief, the loss that still lingered beneath his steady exterior. "I'm not her," Sarah May whispered, her voice trembling. "But I'm here." Caleb's eyes softened, the vulnerability he had kept hidden behind years of solitude, slowly beginning to unravel. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." The distance between them, the silence that had once felt like an impenetrable wall, began to dissolve in that moment. Sarah May felt it, the shift in the air between them. The walls, both his and hers, were starting to come down. Later that evening, after a simple supper of venison stew and freshly baked bread, Caleb poured a small measure of whiskey into a tin cup and passed it to her. She took it carefully, the warmth of the liquid spreading through her chest. "It's not much," Caleb said with a small smile, "but it's mine." Sarah May took a careful sip, the bitter burn of the whiskey sliding down her throat. She coughed slightly, and Caleb laughed, a deep, rich sound that made her smile in return. "You're not used to that, are you?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. "No," Sarah May replied, her voice soft with amusement. "But I think I could get used to it." Caleb didn't answer, but the warmth between them, the shared smile, said more than any words could. As the fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls, Sarah May realized that the cabin, the mountains, Caleb, they had all become home. Not because she had been abandoned elsewhere, but because she had found something here. Something she hadn't known she needed. And now, as she sat by the fire, the warmth of the room wrapping around her like a protective embrace, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. She had a place here, not just beside Caleb, but within herself. And that was something that no storm, no past, no cruelty could ever take from her again. The wind howled outside, but inside, everything was still. The world had fallen silent, and for the first time, Sarah May felt like she had found her peace, her place, the beginning of something new,